She was hired to smile at the right people, laugh at his jokes, and leave without looking back. But nobody warned her that the loneliest man in the room would also turn out to be the most honest one she'd ever met. Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. If you're tuned in and ready to dive into today's story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I'll be bringing you another exciting story you definitely don't want to miss. So, let's get started. The rain came down hard on Manhattan. It always did when Caleb Mercer was in a bad mood, or at least that's what his assistant Dana Cho had started to believe after 18 months of working for him. She'd stopped carrying an umbrella because she'd learned to check his calendar instead. If he had a board meeting before noon and a call with his mother after lunch, she brought an extra jacket and a thermos of strong coffee. If the quarterly projections were off by even 0.5%, she wore waterproof boots. Today, Dana had worn waterproof boots, brought 2 thermoses, and said a quiet prayer in the elevator. Caleb sat behind his desk on the 44th floor of the Mercer Capitol building like a man who had never once in his life been told no. He was 36 years old, 6'2", and had the kind of jaw that made people on the street do quiet double takes. His dark hair was always slightly too long. Not because he forgot to cut it, but because he didn't care enough to schedule it. He wore custom suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent and kept his office at 68 degrees regardless of the season, a detail that every new hire learned the hard way. He was also, at this precise moment, staring at a legal document like it had personally insulted him. "She filed the injunction," he said. "Not a question." "She filed the injunction," Dana confirmed from the doorway. She was Victoria Mercer, his mother, the matriarch of the Mercer family fortune, a woman who had turned emotional manipulation into something close to an art form, and who had spent the last 4 years threatening to invoke the family trust clause that required all Mercer Capital board members to be either married or, quote, demonstrably in a committed long-term relationship by their 37th birthday. Caleb's 37th birthday was 11 weeks away. "She can't actually do this," he said. "Her lawyers say she can," Dana replied carefully. "The clause is in the original 1987 trust agreement. Your grandfather wrote it. It's airtight. My grandfather was also a man who thought fax machines were a passing fad. Nonetheless." Caleb pushed back from the desk and walked to the window. Manhattan spread out below him, gray and gleaming in the rain, 44 floors of insulation between him and the rest of the world. He'd spent a lot of his life up here, in boardrooms, on private jets, in penthouse suites that felt more like hotel lobbies than homes. He was comfortable with distance. Distance was clean. Distance didn't disappoint you. Love, in his experience, did. "If she invokes the clause," he said slowly, "she controls 51% of the voting shares until I either marry or reach 40. That's correct. And she'll use that control to install Marcus on the board." Dana said nothing, which meant yes. Marcus Hale was Victoria Mercer's choice for Caleb's future, not as a friend or an ally, but as a leash, a well-dressed, Harvard-educated leash who would nod at everything Victoria said and dismantle everything Caleb had built over the last decade, piece by careful piece. Caleb turned from the window. "I need a girlfriend," he said. Dana blinked. "I'm sorry. Not a real one. I need someone who can play the part convincingly enough that my mother backs off for 11 weeks. Someone smart. Someone who can handle herself at a gala or a family dinner without flinching. Someone," he paused, "who will sign an NDA and accept a very reasonable financial arrangement." Dana stared at him for a long moment. "You want to hire a fake girlfriend. I want to solve a problem efficiently. Those are not the same thing. In this case they are." He sat back down. "I need 3 candidates by Thursday. Run it through legal, not HR. Absolute discretion. And Dana?" He looked up with those gray eyes that never quite warmed all the way. "Find someone who won't fall in love with me." Dana pressed her lips together. "I'll do my best," she said, in a tone that suggested she found the entire situation professionally exhausting and personally fascinating. Across town, in a third-floor walk-up in Brooklyn that smelled like old books and the Thai place downstairs, Avery Cole was trying to figure out how to pay her rent, her student loan, and her electric bill with a checking account that currently held $214. She sat cross-legged on her second-hand couch with her laptop balanced on a textbook and 3 different tabs open. Her bank statement, a freelance editing job board, and a half-finished cover letter for a position at a literary agency that she'd been writing and rewriting for 6 days because she couldn't quite figure out how to explain that she had a master's degree in English literature from NYU and was currently working part-time at a wine bar in the West Village. She was 28 years old and had what her college roommate, Jade, called the most inconveniently pretty face for someone who refuses to use it. Avery had high cheekbones, warm brown eyes, and dark hair she kept in a low bun that always had at least one strand escaping. She laughed easily, spoke her mind with a directness that unnerved people who weren't expecting it, and had read more books than anyone she'd ever dated. She'd also been single for 14 months, which she told herself was by choice and told no one else anything about at all. Her phone buzzed. "Jade, did you see the posting I sent you?" Avery minimized her cover letter and pulled up her messages. Jade had sent her a link to something called Refined Connections, professional social companionship, with a string of emojis that conveyed enthusiasm without providing clarity. She clicked the link. It was a legitimate agency. She could tell from the design and the legal disclaimers that took up half the page. They placed what they called social companions, people who accompanied clients to events, family gatherings, professional functions, everything above board. NDAs, set contracts, no ambiguity about the nature of the arrangement. Avery scrolled down to the compensation section and stopped breathing for a moment. The listed rate for a long-term arrangement, defined as 6 weeks or more, started at $12,000 a month. Her phone buzzed again. "Jade, before you say no, your rent is due in 8 days and you cried about your student loans last Tuesday." Avery, "I did not cry." "Jade, you teared up, which is the same thing in your face." Avery set the phone down. She looked at her bank statement. She looked at the cover letter she'd been writing for 6 days. She looked at the plant on her windowsill that she'd been meaning to water for 2 weeks and still hadn't. She picked the phone back up. "Avery, I'm not going to do this." She clicked the application link. The interview took place on a Wednesday afternoon at a law office in Midtown that had the kind of waiting room that made you feel like you should whisper. Avery wore her nicest blazer, navy, slightly too big in the shoulders, purchased from a consignment store in Park Slope, and had changed her earrings 3 times before leaving her apartment. She was not nervous. She was economically motivated, which was different. Dana Cho met her in a glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor. She was precise, efficient, and looked at Avery the way a jeweler looks at a stone she's trying to evaluate. Not unkindly, but clinically. "Your background check is clean," Dana said. "Your references are strong. You have a graduate degree, no social media presence that would cause complications, and your work at the wine bar means you're comfortable in high-end environments without being either intimidated or entitled by them." She paused. "Those are all positives." "Thank you," Avery said. "I need to be clear about what this arrangement involves. You would be presented publicly as the long-term girlfriend of a high-profile individual. You would be required to attend approximately 4 to 6 events over the course of 11 weeks, including at minimum 1 family dinner. You would be briefed on background details to ensure conversational consistency. All interactions remain within professional boundaries. You sign an NDA that covers everything before, during, and after. Dana slid a folder across the table. Compensation is $15,000 a month for the duration. Avery kept her face very still. That's above the posted rate. The client has specific requirements and a tight timeline. He's willing to pay for discretion and quality. Dana folded her hands. "Do you have any questions?" Avery had approximately 40 questions, but she picked the most important one. "Who is he?" Dana considered her for a moment. "If you agree to the preliminary NDA, I can tell you that." Avery thought about her $214. She thought about the cover letter she still couldn't finish. She thought about the plant she'd forgotten to water and the life she'd been trying to build in this city for 3 years with the patient, stubborn optimism of someone who had grown up with very little and refused to stop reaching. "All right," she said. "Tell me who he is. If you've ever done something that made complete sense in the moment and absolutely no sense in every moment after, drop a comment below. This story is for you." She signed the preliminary NDA at 3:47 p.m. By 4:15, she was sitting in the back of a black car headed uptown, with a folder in her lap and the name Caleb Mercer turning over in her mind like a coin she wasn't sure how to spend. She'd Googled him the moment Dana left the room. She'd found the Forbes profiles, the Page 6 mentions, the photographs of him at galas in custom suits with his jaw set like a challenge. She'd found the articles about Mercer Capital, about his ruthlessness in negotiations, about the company he'd turned from a modest family investment firm into one of the 5 largest private equity operations on the East Coast. She'd also found one photograph, not from a business profile, but from an old alumni magazine at Columbia, where he'd done his MBA. He was younger in it, maybe 25, sitting on the steps of a library with his tie loosened and a book in his hand, and he was laughing at something out of frame. It was such an unguarded, startlingly warm laugh that for a moment she'd felt like she was looking at someone else entirely. She'd closed that tab quickly. It didn't seem useful. The car stopped in front of the Mercer Capital building. The rain had eased to a fine mist. Avery gathered her folder, straightened her too big blazer, and walked through the glass doors with her chin level and her heart doing something she chose to interpret as professional anticipation. She stepped into the elevator. She pressed 44. She told herself this was a job, a transaction, a solution to a problem with a start date and an end date and nothing in between except performance. She was very good at telling herself things. The elevator opened. Dana was waiting, and at the far end of a long hallway, behind a glass wall, Caleb Mercer looked up from his desk with gray eyes that didn't warm all the way, and for one fraction of a second, something in them shifted. Then it was gone. "Ms. Cole," Dana said. "Right this way." Avery walked forward. The deal was about to begin, and neither of them had any idea what they were actually agreeing to. The office was exactly what she'd expected. Cold, precise, expensive in a way that didn't announce itself but simply was. The way old money always is, quiet and immovable, like bedrock under polished marble. The desk was dark walnut. The bookshelves were real, lined with actual books that looked read rather than staged. The view was all of Manhattan in the rain, gray and glittering, spread out like an argument for ambition. Caleb Mercer was standing when she walked in, which surprised her. She'd expected him to stay seated, the power move, the subtle dominance of making someone walk the full length of the room toward you while you remained still and unmoved. Instead he was at the window, hands in his pockets, and he turned when she entered with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once felt he needed to perform. Up close, he was more human than the photograph suggested. There were faint shadows under his eyes that the magazine profiles never caught. His jaw was sharp, but his expression, at first glance, was more tired than intimidating. He looked like someone who had been solving problems for a very long time and had recently discovered that the problems were not going to stop. "Ms. Cole," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to fill a room. "Mr. Mercer," she replied. They looked at each other for a moment, the particular, careful look of two people trying to assess something they can't quite name yet. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "Please." She sat. He remained standing for another beat, then moved to his chair behind the desk. Not dramatically, just naturally, like someone returning to the place they spend most of their life. Dana had vanished with the silent efficiency that seemed to be her defining trait, closing the door behind her without a sound. Caleb set a folder on the desk between them. "You've reviewed the preliminary terms." "I have. And you're still here." "I'm still here." He studied her for a moment with those gray eyes. "Most people," he said, "when they hear what's being asked, spend the first 10 minutes of this conversation telling me how comfortable they are with the arrangement, how professional, how completely unbothered." Pause. "It's usually the people who protest least at the beginning who cause the most complications later." Avery tilted her head. "Are you warning me or profiling me?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite amusement, but close to its shadow. "Both, possibly." "Then I'll save us some time," she said, folding her hands in her lap with a steadiness she was mostly manufacturing. "I'm not going to tell you I'm comfortable because I'm not sure I am yet. I'm going to tell you I'm practical. I have bills I need to pay, and you have a problem you need to solve. I'm not confused about what this is, and I don't need it to be anything else. She met his gaze directly. I also don't need to be managed. If you tell me what you need, I'll tell you if I can deliver it. A longer pause this time. He leaned back slightly in his chair. You're direct, he said. Is that a problem? No, he said. And this time there was something warmer underneath the word. Something he didn't quite catch before it slipped out. It's actually the first useful thing that's happened today. He explained the situation in clean, unsparing terms. The trust clause. His mother. The 11 weeks. The family dinner in Greenwich that was already scheduled. His mother's annual summer gathering. The one she used as a stage for whatever social theater she was currently producing. He would need Avery at that event. He would also need her at a charity gala in 3 weeks in Chicago. Mercer Capital was a major donor, and appearances mattered. Potentially a board dinner. Possibly 1 or 2 public appearances in between, enough to establish a visible pattern for anyone watching. How long have we supposedly been together? Avery asked, her pen moving over the notepad she'd pulled from her bag. A habit. She took notes when she was thinking. 6 months, he said. Long enough to be serious. Not so long that there are too many details to maintain. Where did we meet? He paused. I hadn't decided. You should decide. People always ask. Especially mothers. She looked up. What do you actually do on weekends when you're not working? He blinked. A small, genuine blink of surprise. Why does that matter? Because if we've been together 6 months and I don't know the answer to that, I'll look like either a bad girlfriend or someone who barely knows you. Both of which undermine the entire arrangement. She set her pen down. So, weekends. He was quiet for a moment, and she got the feeling this was not a question he was asked often. I run, he said finally. Early. Along the river, usually. I read, mostly history, some policy. A beat. I have a house in the Hamptons that I go to maybe 4 times a year. I mostly just, he stopped. Work, she finished. Yes. She wrote something down. Okay. I run too. We met at a bookstore, there's a good one in the West Village, McNally Jackson. You were looking for a Robert Caro biography. I was there for a reading. We talked for 40 minutes and you asked for my number. She looked up. It's specific enough to be credible and vague enough that we can't be fact-checked. He stared at her for a moment. You've thought about this, he said. I thought about it on the car ride over, she said simply. I figured you'd want a plan. Another one of those silences, the kind that had texture to it, that was doing something more than just marking time. He looked at her the way the Columbia photograph had suggested he was capable of looking at things, with actual attention, unguarded and focused, before he remembered to put the professional mask back on. The full NDA covers everything on this list, he said, sliding the folder slightly forward. Non-disclosure, non-disparagement, penalties for breach. There's also a morality clause that protects both parties. He paused. You'll have access to a clothing budget for events. Dana will coordinate. We'll need to meet at least twice before the first public appearance to establish baseline familiarity. Background details, habits, preferences, enough that we can hold a conversation in front of people who know me well. Your mother, Avery said. My mother, he confirmed. Victoria Mercer is not someone who misses things. She'll be watching for inconsistencies. Then we shouldn't have any. He looked at her steadily. Most people are intimidated by her. I'm sure she's very good at that, Avery said pleasantly. I grew up with a grandmother who could silence a room with one look and made her own pie crusts from scratch and never let you forget either. I can handle a difficult woman. This time, the thing that moved behind his eyes made it all the way to his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the shape a smile leaves behind when someone's not quite ready to let it land. It lasted approximately 1 second before he recomposed himself, but Avery saw it. She filed it away without knowing why. All right, he said. He stood, which she understood as the meeting ending. He extended his hand. We have an arrangement, Miss Cole. She stood. She shook his hand. His grip was firm without being performative, and his hand was warm, which she hadn't expected. and she let go before she could notice anything else about it. "We have an arrangement, Mr. Mercer." "Caleb," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "If we're doing this," he said, "you should probably use my first name. For practice." "Caleb," she repeated, testing it. It was a solid name. Unambiguous. "Avery," he said, and something about the way he said it, carefully, like he was making sure he'd remember it, did something small and inconvenient to her composure that she immediately decided not to examine. She picked up her bag. She nodded professionally. She walked to the door. "Ms." he started. She turned. He was still standing behind his desk, hands at his sides, and for a moment he looked almost uncertain, an expression so out of place on his face that it seemed borrowed from someone younger. "The bookstore," he said. "McNally Jackson." "Yes, I do go there. On Saturday mornings." A pause. "Occasionally." She didn't know why he was telling her this. She didn't think he entirely knew either. "Good," she said. "Then that part won't even be a lie." She left. In the elevator on the way down, she leaned against the mirrored wall and let herself have exactly 4 seconds of something she refused to name before she straightened up, fixed her expression, and stepped out into the rain. It was a job. It was practical. It had a start date and an end date. She was very, very good at telling herself things. The first preparation meeting happened 4 days later at his apartment on Central Park West. A detail that recalibrated Avery's sense of scale in a way she hadn't quite braced for. She'd been in nice places before. She'd catered events in nice places, attended parties in nice places, delivered editing work to clients in nice places. But Caleb Mercer's apartment was something categorically different. It occupied the entire top floor of a pre-war building that looked out over the park from every direction, and it had the particular quality of spaces that have been designed by someone with vision and lived in by someone who barely notices, beautiful, immaculate, and somehow deeply, specifically lonely. There were books everywhere. That was the first thing she clocked, stacked on the coffee table, lined along the hall, 2 on the kitchen counter next to an espresso machine that looked like it cost more than her laptop. There were no photographs on display, no personal objects that she could identify. The art on the walls was excellent and entirely abstract. The whole apartment felt, she thought, like a very elegant waiting room for a life that hadn't quite arrived yet. Caleb was in a gray sweater and dark jeans when he opened the door, which was somehow more disarming than the suit. He looked like a person, specifically, less like a Forbes profile and more like a man who had been reading before she arrived and had slightly forgotten, for one unguarded moment, that he was supposed to be formidable. "You found it," he said. "I have Google Maps like everyone else," she said, which made him exhale something that wasn't quite a laugh but functioned as one. They sat at his dining table with their notes and 2 cups of coffee. He made without asking how she took hers, black, which happened to be correct, and which he had apparently noted without her realizing. They spent 2 hours building the architecture of a relationship. The timeline, the details, the plausible texture of 6 months of something that looked like love from the outside. He was allergic to shellfish. She wrote it down. She was afraid of heights, which she offered only because it was relevant. His family had a boat, and she needed him to know that she wouldn't be comfortable on an upper deck. He noted it without comment and moved on, which she appreciated more than she expected to. He'd grown up partly in Greenwich, partly in Manhattan. His father, James Mercer, had died when Caleb was 22, a detail he offered in the same level tone he used for everything else. But something shifted in the room when he said it, something that turned the air a different temperature for just a moment. She didn't push. She wrote it down quietly. She'd grown up in Columbus, Ohio. Middle class, 2 parents, 1 younger brother named Daniel who was now an ER nurse in Cincinnati. She'd come to New York for grad school and stayed because leaving felt like giving up, which was the most honest thing she'd said since she arrived, and she'd said it before she meant to. He looked at her when she said it. Not analytically, just looked the way you look at something that's unexpectedly true. "What did you study?" he asked. "English literature. Focus on contemporary American fiction." "And you wanted to work in publishing?" "Yes." She kept her voice even. "It's taking longer than I planned." He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't say, "I'm sure you'll get there," in the way people do when they want to smooth over a discomfort without engaging with it. He just nodded, slowly, like someone receiving information and actually filing it. She found that she appreciated it considerably. By the time she left, 2 hours had stretched to 3, and the coffee cups had been refilled without either of them officially acknowledging they were still there. The list of facts they'd assembled was thorough. The story they'd built was credible. What neither of them noted, because neither of them was looking for it yet, was that somewhere in the middle of the second hour, they had stopped checking their notes. This story is just getting started, and trust us, the next act will wreck you in the best way possible. Drop a comment right now and tell us. Do you think Avery is already feeling something she won't admit? Let us know below. We read every single one. The Chicago Gala was on a Friday night in June. Avery knew this because she'd had it marked in her calendar for 3 weeks with a small, neat star next to it. Not out of excitement, but out of the particular discipline of someone who treats preparation as armor. She'd read everything she could find about the Mercer Capital Charitable Foundation. She'd memorized the names of the board members, the major donors, the 3 city councilmen who would likely be in attendance. She'd practiced, in the mirror of her Brooklyn bathroom with the water running so her roommate wouldn't hear, the specific way she planned to laugh at things that weren't quite funny enough to warrant a real laugh, light, warm, just enough. She told herself, a professional. The dress Dana had arranged was midnight blue silk, floor-length, simple in the way that only extremely expensive things manage to be simple. It fit perfectly, which was either excellent tailoring or a slightly unsettling attention to detail on Dana's part, and Avery chose not to investigate which. She wore her hair down for the first time in recent memory, dark waves that fell past her shoulders, and small diamond earrings that were on loan from a jewelry service the agency used for exactly these occasions. She looked, when she finally stood in front of the full-length mirror in the hotel room Mercer Capital had booked for her at the Langham in Chicago, like someone she almost recognized. Caleb knocked at exactly 7:45. She opened the door. He was in a black tuxedo, not a rental, not a standard cut, something that had been made specifically for the geometry of his shoulders and the length of his arms, and he had finally gotten a haircut, which made him look both more polished and somehow younger. And for a moment they simply stood in the doorway looking at each other while the hallway hummed with the quiet of a good hotel on a Friday night. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said, because she could hear the professional calculation in the pause before the compliment. The sense of him assembling the right words for the right performance, and something in her didn't want to hear it framed that way. He stopped. He looked at her more carefully, at the almost defensiveness in her expression, at the tiny tail of her chin lifting slightly. And then he said quietly, without any calculation in it at all, "I was going to say you look like yourself. I wasn't sure that would translate as a compliment, but it is one." She had no prepared response for that. "Thank you," she said, after a beat. "You look considerably less like a Forbes cover than usual." He did the almost smile again. "Is that good?" "Tonight it is," she said, picking up her small clutch from the entryway table. "Shall we?" He offered his arm. She took it, the first time they'd touched since the handshake in his office 3 weeks ago, and the warmth of his arm through the tuxedo jacket was something she noted with the clinical detachment of someone making an observation and then immediately moving on. They walked down the hallway toward the elevator. Her heels were quiet on the carpet. His stride adjusted, without comment, to match hers. She noticed. She moved on. The gala was exactly what she'd prepared for and somehow, still, more than she'd quite anticipated. The grand ballroom of the Lyric Opera House had been transformed with the kind of effortless grandeur that required enormous amounts of effort to achieve. White flowers massed on every surface, candlelight refracted through crystal, 500 people dressed in the specific uniform of wealth performing generosity for each other with practiced ease. A string quartet played something classical and unobtrusive near the entrance. Waiters navigated the crowd with champagne that probably cost more per bottle than Avery's electric bill. She'd been to nice events before. She had not been to this. Caleb's hand moved to the small of her back the moment they entered the room. Light, brief, more instinct than action. A guiding pressure that disappeared almost as soon as it registered. But it sent a clear signal to the room, "We are together." And the room received it exactly as intended. Heads turned. Eyes tracked them. Two women near the bar leaned together with the particular synchrony of people exchanging information. "Reynolds at 9 o'clock, Caleb said, low and close to her ear, his voice a private frequency in the noise of the room. "He's on the foundation board. He'll want to talk acquisitions. I need 3 minutes with him and then we move on." "Got it," she said. "Who should I watch out for?" "Sandra Holt. She runs the Chicago chapter and she's a sweet woman, but she'll talk to you for 45 minutes about her Labrador if you give her an opening." "Noted. What's the Labrador's name?" He blinked. "Why would I know that?" "Because the next time you see her, knowing the dog's name will make her like you 20% more and take up 30% less of your time." She smiled pleasantly at someone across the room. "We'll find out tonight." She felt rather than saw the look he gave her, sideways, thoughtful, the look of someone filing something away. They moved through the room together with the particular ease of two people who had, it turned out, prepared well. She held her champagne without drinking much. She remembered names. She laughed at the right moments, asked the right questions, deflected the ones she couldn't answer by redirecting attention back to whoever was speaking. A skill she developed not from training but from years of being the kind of person who made other people feel genuinely heard. It worked. Better than it should have. At one point, a man named Gerald Fitch, red-faced, jovial, third-generation Chicago money, clapped Caleb on the shoulder and said, "Caleb, I have to tell you, I wasn't sure about you settling down, but I'll say it. She's something else." He beamed at Avery. "You're the first person I've ever seen make this man look like he's actually glad to be somewhere." Avery laughed easily. "He hides it well," she said. "But he's a secret optimist." Gerald Fitch roared with laughter. Caleb looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not quite amusement, not quite surprise. Something more complicated than either. "Is that so?" he said quietly to her alone. "I'm improvising," she said, equally quiet. "You're very good at it." "I know," she said. "Try to look charmed." "I don't think that's going to require much effort," he said. And then the moment was interrupted by someone arriving at Caleb's left shoulder. And the conversation folded back into the professional and they both moved on. And Avery held the words at a careful arm's length for the rest of the night. It was after 11 when they finally extracted themselves. The car back to the hotel was quiet in the way that follows a long performance. The specific quiet of two people who have been on for hours and are now slowly, carefully coming down. The city moved past the windows and lights and dark water and the occasional lit bridge, and Avery had taken off her heels in the car because her feet were articulating a series of complaints she could no longer ignore. "The dog's name," Caleb said suddenly, out of nowhere. She turned. "Sandra Holt's Labrador," he said. "You found out." "Biscuit," she confirmed. 8 years old. Loves the lake. Hates thunderstorms. Pause. "She showed me 17 photographs." He looked at her for a moment with that focused, unguarded attention. "You actually listened to all of it?" "Of course. Most people would have found an excuse to move on." Avery shrugged slightly. She was proud of him. "It cost me nothing to let her be." She looked back out the window. "People remember how you made them feel. That matters, even when the reason you're there isn't entirely straightforward." A silence followed. A different kind of silence than the professional ones they'd been trading all evening. Something more open, less managed. "Why publishing?" he asked. She looked back at him. The question was unexpected, out of sequence with their established interview format. Not something either of them had planned for tonight. "Because stories matter," she said simply. "The right book at the right moment can rearrange the entire way you understand yourself. I wanted to be part of that." Pause. "I still do. I just also need to pay rent while I figure out the path there." He was quiet. "What about you?" she asked, and immediately added, "I know that's not in the script." "No," he said. "It's all right." He looked out his own window. The city was thinning as they approached the hotel district. "My father started Mercer Capital as something genuinely small, a neighborhood investment group in Greenwich. He believed in it, in the idea that capital could be a tool for things that mattered, not just for accumulation." He paused. "When he died, the firm was mid-size. Good, not great. I spent the next decade making it great. For him? Avery asked. A long pause. I told myself that, he said. For the first few years. He didn't say what came after that, but the silence that followed the sentence did the work instead. The particular silence of someone who has arrived at a truth they haven't quite sorted out yet. Caleb, she said, not performing, just saying his name. He looked at her. For what it's worth, she said carefully. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? The Forbes profile, she said honestly. Cold. Transactional. Someone who'd treat this like a supply chain problem. She paused. You're still transactional. Thank you. But you're not cold, she finished. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. The car was slowing. The Langham's entrance appeared outside the window, all brass and soft light. You're not what I expected either, he said. What did you expect? He considered it. Someone easier to categorize, he said finally. The car stopped. The door opened. They stepped out into the warm Chicago night, and the hotel doorman greeted them, and the moment folded back into logistics. Keycards, elevator, the professional mechanics of two people saying goodnight in a hallway. At her door, she turned. He was a few feet away, hands in his pockets, and he looked, for just a moment, in the warm, low light of the hallway. Like that photograph again. The one from Columbia. Young and unguarded and lit by something she couldn't name. Good night, Caleb, she said. Good night, Avery. She went inside. She set her heels down by the door. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed in her midnight blue dress and stared at the middle distance for a long moment. It's a job, she told herself. It has a start date and an end date. But somewhere between the ballroom and the car and a quiet conversation about a Labrador named Biscuit, the architecture of her certainty had developed a crack. Small, hairline thin, enough to let something in. 3 days after Chicago, Caleb called her. Not Dana. Not a calendar invite routed through the agency. He called, from his own number, at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, and when she answered she could hear the sound of the river in the background, the particular texture of outdoor air and moving water that she recognized because she'd walked that same path along the Hudson more times than she could count. I have a question, he said, without preamble. Good morning to you too, she said, sitting up in bed with her coffee. Good morning. A pause, and she could hear, in the pause, the slight recalibration of someone who's realized they've skipped a social step and isn't sure whether to go back for it. I have a question. You said that. The Greenwich dinner is in 5 weeks. My mother will have done research before we arrive. She'll know things about you. Possibly things you haven't anticipated. I anticipated that, Avery said. She'll look into my background, my financials, possibly my social media. She'll find the wine bar, the NYU degree, the Brooklyn address. She'll draw conclusions. She'll draw unflattering ones, he said. About your financial situation. Your career status. I know. And, Avery took a sip of coffee. And I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Columbus, Ohio, with 1 bathroom and a dad who worked double shifts at a machine shop and a mom who did alterations out of the kitchen. I don't embarrass easily about money, Caleb. People who've actually had to think about it rarely do. Silence from his end. The river. A bird. Distant. She's going to try to make you feel small, he said. And there was something different in his voice now. Not a warning. Not a professional briefing. Something more like concern, quiet and slightly out of practice. I know, Avery said. But here's the thing about people who try to make you feel small. She paused. They need you to agree with them for it to work. And I don't agree. Another silence. Longer this time. Avery, he said. Yes. Are you free Saturday? She blinked. That's not on the schedule. I know. I'm asking anyway. A beat. There's a farmer's market on the Upper West Side. I go occasionally. It would be useful. For continuity. Establishing a visible pattern. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the morning light coming through her Brooklyn window, warm and unhurried. It would be useful, she agreed carefully. Good. He paused once more, and this pause was different from all the professional pauses before it. This one was softer at the edges, less managed. I'll meet you there. 9 o'clock. He hung up. Avery sat with her phone in her lap and her coffee getting cold and the morning light stretching longer across her floor. She thought about the way he'd said she's going to try to make you feel small. Not as analysis, not as logistics, but with the quiet protectiveness of someone who didn't want that to happen. She thought about the river sounds in the background. She thought about a man who said he went to a farmer's market, occasionally calling her on a Tuesday morning to invite her there. The hairline crack in her certainty opened another millimeter. She told herself it was the light. The morning light always made things feel more significant than they were. She was becoming considerably less convincing, even to herself. Saturday was golden. One of those early summer New York mornings that feels like the city has forgiven you for every hard winter. All clear sky and warm air and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the market stalls set up along Columbus Avenue, green awnings and bright flowers and the comfortable Saturday noise of a neighborhood living its best unhurried version of itself. Caleb was there when she arrived. He was in dark jeans and a worn navy Henley, which she was beginning to understand was his private version of casual, and he was standing in front of a flower stall looking slightly out of place in the best possible way. A man too accustomed to polished environments momentarily surrendered to something simpler and warmer. He had, she noticed, already bought coffee. 2 cups. He held one out when he saw her without saying anything, and she took it, and they fell into step together without ceremony. They walked the market for 2 hours. They argued gently about tomatoes. He had opinions about sourdough that were more passionate than she'd expected, and she told him so, and he said it's the one thing I actually know how to make, in a tone of such undefended honesty that she nearly stopped walking. She bought a book from a second-hand table, a worn copy of Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, 50 cents, and he asked if she'd read it before, and she said twice, and he said, "What does it do to you, a book you've already read?" And the question was so unexpectedly beautiful, so precisely the question she'd have wanted someone to ask about that specific book, that she looked at him sideways for a long moment before she answered. "It does something different each time," she said. "Because you're different each time. The book stays still and you keep changing, and so it keeps meeting you where you actually are." He was quiet for a moment. The market moved around them. "I've read the same 3 books 4 or 5 times each," he said. "I never thought about it that way." "What 3 books?" He told her. She hadn't expected the answers. One was The Power Broker, Robert Caro, which fit. One was a collection of letters between James Baldwin and various contemporaries, which surprised her in the best way. And one was a slim, battered novel she'd never heard of, something his father had given him when he was 17, which he described only as the one book that made me understand what kind of man I didn't want to be. "And did it work?" she asked. A long pause. They had stopped walking, she realized. Standing near the edge of the market where the stalls thinned out and the park began, the green opening up behind them like a held breath. "I'm still trying to figure that out," he said. He looked at her steadily, that focused, unguarded look that was becoming, she recognized with a particular internal alarm, something she watched for, something she had started to wait for. Around them, a couple walked a golden retriever. A child was eating an enormous blueberry muffin with the concentrated joy of someone experiencing bliss. 2 elderly men played chess at a folding table. All of Manhattan on a Saturday morning, alive and ordinary and beautiful. "Avery," he said, her name in his voice. The way he said it, still careful, still like he was making sure he'd remember it, but something added now, some frequency underneath it that hadn't been there in the office or the hotel hallway. "Don't," she said, softly. "No edge in it. Just don't." He understood what she meant. She could see that he understood, because he closed the almost sentence and looked away, and when he looked back his expression had been gently recomposed. They both understood the rules. They had signed documents itemizing the rules. But the rules, she was discovering, had not been written to account for farmers' markets on golden Saturday mornings, or books and their effect on the people who carry them, or the particular way someone can look at you like you're a sentence they want to keep reading. She looked at her watch. "I should get back," she said. "I have a shift at 7. "Of course. Professional. Kind. Absolutely impossible to fault." They walked to the market entrance. He flagged her a cab, the old-fashioned way, stepping slightly ahead of her and raising his hand with the quiet authority of someone who has done it 1,000 times. The cab stopped. She got in. 5 weeks, he said through the window. Greenwich. The dinner. The arrangement which had an end date which was the entire point. 5 weeks, she confirmed. The cab pulled away. She watched him through the back window, standing on Columbus Avenue in his navy Henley, hands in his pockets, watching the cab for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he turned and walked back toward the park. She turned forward. She did not examine what she felt. She examined it anyway, the whole ride home, and found something she recognized with a clarity that was equal parts wonderful and terrifying. She was not pretending anymore. She wasn't sure she had been for a while. Here's what we want to know, and we genuinely want you to tell us in the comments. At what point do you think Avery stopped pretending? Was it Chicago? The farmer's market? The first cup of coffee? Drop your answer below. This conversation is everything. Greenwich in July was beautiful in the way that old money always is. Unhurried, immaculate, and faintly hostile to anyone who hadn't grown up inside it. The Mercer estate sat on 4 acres of manicured Connecticut landscape, a white colonial with black shutters and a circular driveway that had seen decades of arrivals from people who understood exactly what arriving there meant. Roses lined the front path. Real ones, tended by a gardener named Earl who'd worked the property for 30 years. The lawn rolled down to a private dock where a sailboat rested on still water like a punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence about inherited wealth. Avery had worn a pale cream dress. Simple. Good fabric. She'd made that choice herself, declining the third option Dana had offered because the third option had felt like costuming, and she'd decided somewhere between Chicago and this morning that she was done performing for rooms she hadn't chosen. She was, however, still holding Caleb's hand a little tighter than the arrangement technically required. He noticed. He didn't comment. He simply adjusted his grip, steadier, like a man recalibrating his footing. Victoria Mercer was 71 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had decided in her 40s that she would never again apologize for taking up space. She was silver-haired, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed, and she looked at Avery the way a chess player looks at a move they haven't seen before. Not threatened, but intensely focused. "So," she said, over a pre-dinner drink on the back terrace, while 12 other guests orbited politely around them, "You work at a wine bar." "Part-time," Avery said. "I also do freelance editing. Literary fiction, mostly. And before that, a master's degree." Victoria's tone was perfectly pleasant and surgically precise. "NYU. English literature." Pause that carried weight. "That's an expensive education for an uncertain outcome." "Most worthwhile things are," Avery said, matching her pleasantness exactly. Victoria's eyes sharpened. "Caleb has a complicated life. Significant pressure. He needs someone who can be a partner in that. Not a project he has to carry." "I agree completely," Avery said. "Fortunately, I've never needed carrying." A silence. Then something shifted in Victoria's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular recalibration of a woman who has been preparing for softness and has encountered something with structure instead. Across the terrace, Caleb was watching. Avery could feel it. Dinner was 12 courses of quiet warfare. Victoria asked pointed questions. Avery answered them, honestly, without apology, without performance. She spoke about Columbus, about her parents, about the 2 years after her master's when she'd worked 3 jobs and still believed she was moving toward something. She didn't sand the edges off any of it. She didn't translate herself for the room. Caleb was quiet beside her. But his hand found hers under the table at some point during the 4th course, and stayed there. It was after dessert that Marcus Hale arrived, late, which was clearly staged, with the easy smile of someone who knows the stage has been set for them. He was handsome, polished, and looked at Avery with the specific curiosity of someone gathering ammunition. "So you're the reason Caleb's finally playing by the rules," he said, pleasantly enough. "Marcus," Caleb said. "One word. A wall. I'm just saying it's a big change. 6 months ago..." Marcus paused, swirling his wine. "Well, we all remember 6 months ago." The table went careful and quiet. "Marcus," Victoria's voice, a warning but a thin one. "I'm curious," Marcus continued, looking at Avery with a pleasant smile that didn't reach anything behind his eyes. "Does she know about the arrangement?" About why you're here, specifically. He let that sit. Because I do. Dana's not as discreet as she thinks she is. The table was very still. Avery felt Caleb go rigid beside her. She felt the moment tilting, the carefully constructed architecture beginning to fracture under the weight of the truth in the room, and she felt, with absolute clarity, that the next 10 seconds would determine everything. She could leave. She could confirm it. She could let the arrangement collapse tidily and professionally with its documentation intact and her dignity preserved. She looked at Caleb. His jaw was set. His eyes were straight ahead. But his hand under the table was still holding hers, and the grip had changed. It was no longer the steady, recalibrated grip of a man maintaining a performance. It was the grip of someone holding on. She turned to Marcus with a calm, level smile. I know everything about why I'm here, she said quietly. I'm here because he asked me to be. And yes, it started as an arrangement. She paused, and what came next was not in any script, not in any NDA, not in any document Dana had ever prepared. It came from somewhere that had been building since a farmer's market on a Saturday morning and a conversation about what a book does to you the second time you read it. But I'm not here for the arrangement anymore. I'm here because somewhere between Chicago and a farmer's market and 3 a.m. texts about Robert Caro, I stopped pretending. And I think, she turned and looked directly at Caleb, because this was not for the table, this was only for him. I think you did too. A while ago. The table held its breath. Caleb looked at her. Really looked, the fully unguarded version, no professional distance, no managed expression. Just a man who had spent a very long time keeping the world at 44 floors worth of distance. Looking at the one person who had somehow arrived anyway. Yes, he said. Quiet. Absolute. The most uncomplicated thing he'd said in years. I did. Victoria Mercer set down her wine glass. Her expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then, slowly, something in it released. Something she'd been holding, some test whose result she'd just received. She said nothing, but she reached over and refilled Avery's glass herself, which, Caleb would later tell Avery, was the closest his mother had come to a standing ovation in 30 years. Marcus left shortly after. Nobody watched him go. We need to know. Did that dinner scene give you chills? Tell us in the comments exactly what moment hit hardest, because this cast of characters has one more act to break your heart wide open in the best way. Drop your thoughts below, we'll see you there. They drove back to Manhattan in silence. Not the managed silence of two professionals maintaining appropriate distance, and not the uncomfortable silence of people who have said too much. It was the particular silence of something that has finally been set down, a weight carried so long that the absence of it changes the way you breathe. Avery watched Connecticut give way to the highway give way to the city's outer edges, the outer edges give way to the lit corridors of Manhattan arriving around them like a conversation resuming mid-sentence. She had her heels off again. Her cream dress caught the passing light in intervals. She was thinking about what she'd said at that table and finding, to her own quiet amazement, that she didn't want a single word of it back. Caleb drove. He hadn't handed the keys to a driver tonight. He'd driven himself, which she understood now as one of his private tells. The things he did when he needed to feel like he was the one moving rather than being moved. His hands were easy on the wheel. His jaw had unclenched somewhere around the Connecticut border. Somewhere past the Triborough Bridge, he said. You didn't have to do that. I know, she said. You could have let it fall apart. Collected what was owed and walked away clean. I know that too. Pause. The city lights multiplied around them. Why didn't you? He asked. Not pressuring. Not performing. Just asking. The way you ask something when the answer genuinely matters and you've run out of reasons to pretend it doesn't. Avery turned from the window to look at him. His profile in the city light, the jaw, the slightly too long again hair, the hands on the wheel. A man who had built 44 floors between himself and the world and had somehow, in 11 weeks, let her take the elevator up without entirely meaning to. Because it was true, she said simply. And I've spent enough of my life being careful about things that were true. He was quiet for a long moment. The car moved through the city's Friday night, alive and unhurried around them. Avery. Her name. That frequency underneath it, the one she'd stopped pretending not to hear. Yes. I don't know how to do this, he said. Whatever this is now, I want to be honest with you about that. He paused, and she could see him selecting the word with the precision of someone who knows the difference between accuracy and performance. Closed. For a long time, after my father died, I made the company the whole thing, the entire architecture, and I was good at it. I am good at it. But it's lonely, she said. He exhaled. Yes, I know, she said. I could see it the first day, in the apartment. All those books and no photographs. He glanced at her quick sideways. You noticed that. I notice most things, she said. It's a reading habit. You pay attention to what's in the room and what isn't. The car turned onto Central Park West. The park was dark and enormous on their left, full of the particular quiet of a city holding its breath. He pulled to a stop in front of his building and the doorman moved toward the car and then, reading something in the stillness inside the vehicle, wisely found somewhere else to be for a moment. Caleb turned in his seat, looked at her directly in the way she had come to understand was his most honest register. No managed distance, no professional frame. Just the man. The arrangement ends in 3 weeks, he said. I'm aware. I don't want it to end in 3 weeks. The words landed quietly, without drama, which made them land harder. She looked at him. He looked back. The city moved around the still point of the car, and neither of them moved toward the other and neither of them moved away. Caleb, she said carefully, whatever we say tonight, I need it to be real, not a new arrangement, not a logical solution to a different problem. She held his gaze. I've been pretending for a living in one way or another for 3 years, in that wine bar, in that apartment, in my own head telling myself I was fine. I can't do a version of that with you. I won't. I'm not asking you to, he said, and his voice was low and absolutely unambiguous. I'm asking you to give me the chance to figure out how to be someone worth not pretending with. Pause. That's all. That's the whole ask. Avery looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a bookstore in the West Village and a Robert Caro biography and a story they'd built to be credible and had accidentally built to be true. She thought about a farmer's market and a worn copy of Gilead and what a book does to you the second time around, when you're different and it meets you where you actually are. She thought about the grip of his hand under a dinner table, holding on. Okay, she said, soft, certain. Okay, he repeated. The doorman, sensing something had concluded, reappeared and opened the car door. They stepped out into the warm Manhattan night, not holding hands, not performing anything for anyone, just 2 people standing on the sidewalk at the end of a long and significant evening. Come up, he said. I'll make coffee. It's midnight, she said. I know, he said. Come up anyway. She did. The apartment felt different that night. She couldn't have said exactly what had changed. The books were in the same places, the art still abstract on the walls, the city still spread out beyond the windows in its magnificent, indifferent enormity. But something had shifted in the quality of the space, some property of the air, as though the rooms had been waiting for something to change the temperature of them, and it had, finally, quietly arrived. He made coffee at the kitchen counter and she sat on the bar stool on the other side and they talked. Not about the dinner, not about Marcus or Victoria or the trust clause or any of the architecture of the last 11 weeks. They talked the way people talk when the reason they came together has dissolved into something larger and they are just, finally, themselves. She told him about the first book that had broken her open. She was 11, her mother had handed her a library copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and she'd read it in a single weekend and come downstairs on Sunday night unable to fully explain what had happened to her. Her mother had looked at her face and said, "Ah, you found one," as if it were a natural landmark, as if everyone eventually arrived there. He told her about his father. More than the single careful sentence from before, the fuller version, the one with texture and loss in it. How James Mercer had been the kind of man who remembered everyone's name and meant it, who had built something not because he wanted to be powerful but because he believed it could matter. How Caleb had spent 15 years building the company larger and larger and had recently, quietly, begun to wonder if larger was the direction his father had actually meant. What direction did he mean? Avery asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Better, he said finally. I think he just meant better. She reached across the counter and covered his hand with hers. Not strategically, not as performance. Just the simple human gesture of one person telling another, I hear you. That matters. He turned his hand over and held hers. They stayed like that, the coffee getting cold, the city doing its patient, luminous thing beyond the windows. And neither of them felt the need to fill the silence because the silence was, for once, entirely full. 2 weeks later, Victoria Mercer called Caleb on a Thursday morning. He told Avery about it that evening. They were in her Brooklyn apartment. His second visit, the first having been the previous weekend when he'd shown up with sourdough he'd made himself and looked endearingly uncertain on her doorstep, and she was sitting on her second-hand couch with her feet tucked under her while he sat at the other end, his jacket off, her copy of Gilead open in his lap. She said, Caleb reported, with the careful tone of a man still processing, that she's withdrawing the injunction. Avery looked up from her laptop. Why? She said. He paused, and something moved across his face that was unambiguously, helplessly warm. She said she watched you at that table, and you were the first person she'd met in 20 years who talked to her like she was a person rather than a gate to get through. He paused again. She also said, and I want to be precise here, that anyone who could make me look at someone the way I apparently looked at you during dessert was, quote, not a woman to let out of the family. Avery stared at him. Then she laughed. A real one, unguarded and full, the kind that takes over the whole face. He watched it happen with the expression of a man who has discovered something he intends to spend a significant amount of time pursuing. Your mother, Avery said, is something else. She is, he agreed. She also asked for your number, separately, for reasons she declined to specify. I'll take that as a good sign. It is, he said. Trust me. In 36 years, she has never asked for anyone's number. Avery smiled and looked back at her laptop. He looked back at Gilead. The Brooklyn apartment held them both. Small and warm and full of the particular grace of a space where two people have decided, without fanfare or formal declaration, that they want to keep being in the same room. After a while, he read aloud a passage he'd found. His voice in her apartment, low and unhurried, reading a beautiful sentence out of a book she loved. She stopped typing and just listened. Outside, Brooklyn went about its evening. Somewhere below, the Thai place was open, and the smell of it drifted up through the old building's bones. A bus went by. A child laughed on the sidewalk below the window. All of it ordinary. All of it precisely because of that extraordinary. This was not in the NDA. This was not in the arrangement. This was something that had grown in the margins of a contract that neither of them had ever really been following. Something that had needed no clause, no schedule, no document to make it real. It was real because it was real. And neither of them had an end date for it. Not anymore. If the story moved you, if any moment of it landed somewhere that mattered, we want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell us, what was the line, the scene, the moment that got you? And if you know someone who needs a story like this today, share it with them. We'll be here, and we read every single word you leave us. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.